welcome to the last two lectures of the semester. These lectures are on Louise Antony's paper, which is a reply to Naomi Scheman's paper, Feminist Epistemology, and it was given as comments to Scheman's paper. So like Scheman read her paper, and then Antony got up and read hers, and then Scheman had a reply also, which I'll post online for people to read. But I'm not going to lecture about that. There's just going to be two more lectures, two parts, both on Antony's paper. Part one of these two lectures is going to focus on Antony's efforts to distinguish what makes her a feminist epistemologist from Scheman's. In some ways, part of her argument is that the term feminist shouldn't be attached to the subset of epistemological views that Scheman and Code are defending, but can have a broader scope. And then Antony sets out two charges that she sees the feminist epistemologists making against the classical epistemologists. And Antony's mission in this paper is to stick up for classical epistemology. So she's going to consider each of the two objections one at a time and try to diffuse them. And then she gives some positive arguments in favor of classical epistemology. One of them is an empirical argument, which says basically it's an empirical scientific fact that we have things in common that can be the focus of epistemology. And second is that she thinks it's pragmatically important to appeal to universal rationality as a grounds for advancing social justice. So she thinks if we get rid of the idea of objective rationality, that's actually going to hurt feminism and other kinds of social justice movements. So this lecture is going to just focus on the beginning and charge one, and then the second part we'll look at charge two and the positive arguments that she gives for the classical view. So Antony starts by saying, here's a bunch of things I have in common with Naomi Scheman. So the idea that there's a need for a feminist epistemology, that there's a need to look at politics when doing epistemology, and that basically doing this political analysis when looking at classical epistemological problems should lead you to do epistemology in a different way, in a new way. So Antony says, if you think that that's what is required to be counted as a feminist epistemologist, then I am one. But then the things that she doesn't agree with are the kind of even more radical parts of the view that Scheman and Code develop. So she says she doesn't think that doing feminist epistemology means that you have to accept any particular philosophical views. Whereas Scheman and Code have these particular philosophical commitments that they want to take on, things about like what objectivity is, and views about the sort of ineliminability of politics from anything that can be counted as epistemological. So notice that there's this difference. Antony says, no, I think that we should be paying attention to politics, but I'm not saying that every single thing is political. That's kind of one of the main distinctions. And so connected with that, Antony also wants to stick up for traditional philosophical methodology. So she's rejecting the claim that we need to do radical political thought in every corner for every project that a philosopher might pursue. And in fact, that doing the sort of traditional a priori kinds of conceptual analysis coupled with good value-neutral science, that's the other thing, she's in favor of this value-neutral science angle. It's possible, according to Antony, to develop value-neutral science. Or at least what she says is we shouldn't rule out that possibility on the basis of past failures. Just because we haven't managed to do it yet doesn't mean that we can't achieve it later, or work to achieve it at least. Okay, so summarizing Antony's main points, her main view that she wants to argue for anyway, is that there's nothing wrong with S knows that P epistemology. There's nothing intrinsically bad about doing generic generic subject philosophy of knowledge. That's one thing. And she also, and sort of tied in related to that, is the idea that that there are universal traits of human beings that are central to their capacity as knowers, and we can theorize about them, meaning like we can say universally valid things, universal generalizations that hold of every example of a cognizer of a human type anyway. And as we'll get to in the second of these two lectures, that's tied in with her idea that there's a scientific enterprise, a scientific theory that shows us what humans are like in epistemologically relevant ways. They're alike in relevant ways that make them sort of a single kind. And then epistemology can theorize about that kind and give us a universal theory of human cognition or something like that, empirically based. Okay, briefly to give the overview of the two charges that Antony sees Scheman raising against classical epistemology. The first charge is the foundational concepts of mainstream classic traditional abstract epistemology. The foundational concepts are reason, rationality, the knowing subject, I suppose knowledge, maybe justification. So the charge from the feminist epistemologists is that these foundational concepts embody male bias, or maybe more generally speaking, embody the biases implicit in the identity of the theorizer who traditionally created them. So maybe not just male bias, but like heterosexuality bias and whiteness bias and class bias and all these different categories of domination that we've been talking about. So that's the first one, is that the foundational concepts are imbued with bias. The second is that the unexamined universalism, the generalized approach to doing epistemology has this ideological function. And what that means, what an ideology is it's a set of ideas propagated through a society that functions to obscure relations of domination and oppression. So to say that epistemology serves an ideological function in that sense is to say that it presents a set of ideas that justify and reproduce or reinforce existing hierarchies of social order, relationships of oppression, domination, that kind of thing. It just looks so strange to me. I'm back on the grounds of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, by the way. So in the next video, I'll talk about that second one a little bit more and Anthony's reply to it. But right now, I just want to focus on the first charge, which is the idea that these foundational concepts embody male bias. So Antony doesn't think that's true. She thinks that those concepts are good and that they're sufficiently universal. And in fact, that feminists should endorse and adopt them. Like, feminists should be claiming that women are rational in just the same sense that the word has always been used. They shouldn't be saying rationality of the word encodes this male bias and that there's somehow something problematic about it. In other words, we should own the term and use it to, legitimate the oppressed groups that have been traditionally denied rationality. So her example, and she says, Antony says, I know that the men in philosophy have been sexist, and that the history of philosophy has lots of examples of this. So, for example, Aristotle thought that women weren't rational. And she says, Aristotle had a theory of rationality. Aristotle had a theory of human nature. Aristotle's the one who said man is the rational animal. And then his bias tells him that women aren't rational and men are. And then Antony says, does he conclude, therefore, counterexample to my theory, since women are human, they must be rational? But Aristotle says, no, women aren't fully human. That's his response to it. So, misogynistic, sexist, Antony is saying, that's screwed up. We shouldn't go along with Aristotle, obviously. But her complaint about the charge that the concept of rationality is inherently male biased, she says to Scheman and like-minded folks, well, isn't the right thing to say, isn't that the concept is biased? The thing we should say is that Aristotle was just wrong, that women are not rational. We should say, no, women are rational. That was Aristotle's mistake. He identified a perfectly good universal concept. It may or may not be the essence of what humanity is, but regardless, he picked out this thing, and then he falsely denied that women have it. So Antony's reply to charge 1 is, we should be claiming these concepts in a universal sense. We shouldn't be sort of ceding that ground to the misogynists and the racists and stuff like that. We should be able to say, all people are rational. It's not that like only white people have, or Europeans or whatever, have rationality. Okay, so that's her response to charge 2. Charge 1. That's her response to charge 1. So I want to pause to think about whether or not it's a good reply. So when it comes to the function of rationality as exclusion that Code and Scheman have talked about, the idea is that in characterizing rationality, I implicitly sort of take my own perspective to be the one true view, and then I deny that people who don't agree with me have this feature of rationality. So Scheman sees this as a reason to be suspicious of anybody who's using the word rationality. In some sense, thinks that the concept can't be salvaged because any attempt to use it is going to build in some kind of politically oriented bias. So in contrast to that, I think Antony's view is, I don't think that she would want to deny that people have used the word rationality, they've weaponized it, you might say, in order to exclude people, justify conquest, justify subordination of women, keeping them out of government, don't let people vote because they're not rational. That's the kind of stuff that's been used to do. But I think Antony's position on this is we shouldn't just throw the baby out with the bathwater. We should keep the concept of rationality, and instead of arguing that we shouldn't use it, we should defend the claim that all these various people who have been marginalized by the misuse of that term actually should count as rational, and therefore that's a reason for them to be given, the rights and privileges or whatever of like the citizen. Okay, so that may or may not be the best answer. I think that I can definitely see where it's coming from. So I find that those arguments are pretty strong. So that's where I'll leave us with this video, and I'll be right back. 2 lectures in 1 walk, trying to finish everything today. So I'll be right back with part 2.